Alright folks, let's talk about the best-selling Warhammer releases of all time. Not rumours, not this sold out in 5 minutes so it must be number one, but the releases based on what we do know have pushed serious volume over time. Because Games Workshop doesn't publish exact unit sales. So if you want a real answer, you have to look at the patterns. What gets reprinted, what sticks around, and what becomes the default way for people to enter the hobby. And once you do all that, the answers are actually pretty consistent. First up, we have to talk about Space Hulk. This is probably the most reliable specialist game that Games Workshop has ever produced. Multiple editions, decades apart, and the same pattern each time. People pile in for Space Hulk, and then it disappears again. And that only works if it sells repeatedly. The interesting thing about Space Hulk is that it ticks three massive boxes at the same time. The hobbyists and the painters, the 40k and other specialist games players, as well as, and this is a huge one, the board game players. And these guys aren't necessarily the same people that collect whole armies and paint as well. These are people that are on the periphery, if that's a word, of the hobby, and the sort of general board game players get involved in Space Hulk. I remember seeing Space Hulk in the catalogue at a board game cafe in New Zealand. Now, Space Hulk is definitely due for a refresh because it is still a massive, massive cult game, and you see people playing it all the time. I was at Adepticon and there was a huge Space Hulk 3D table with about 15 players playing around it, and it was just awesome. You can go onto eBay and fork out an absolute fortune on a battered and crumpled edition of Space Hulk because that is how sought after it is. Games Workshop know exactly what they're doing. The next time they release it, the fever for Space Hulk will be even bigger. I suspect that we will be getting it quite soon. Obviously, the last edition of 40k, we had new Terminators, so I think we're due a refresh for Space Hulk. If you're listening, Games Workshop, bring it out, we need it right now. Next up, we have the Adeptus Sororitas refresh. Now, this was an interesting one because this was a full reset of a very, very loved faction in 40k, the Sisters of Battle. Now, Jez Goodwin's Metal Sisters of Battle were some of the best miniatures, I believe, in 40k of all time, but they were metal and they did need a refresh because they were around, quite frankly, for a very long time. So when they got their full plastic refresh and glow up, to want for a better word, this was a huge deal. It was years of pent-up frustration and demand for a very, very well-loved faction. And Games Workshop didn't just drop the one box, they sort of drip-fed it over the course of a year or two, and we have this awesome, glorious-looking range that I believe is truly some of the best miniature design that Games Workshop has ever done. And Sisters of Battle, or Adeptus Sororitas, if you want to call it that, are seen in every Golden Demon cabinet. They're seen in so many Instagram pics, and they are really popular as a faction, and these plastic miniatures really were a glow up to an already good aesthetic and vibe that we had going on before. They're just awesome. Now, there have been many editions of 40k and Fantasy Battle. We are looking at 11th edition 40k coming out very soon, and now we're in Age of Sigmar, and Old World has come back too, but we'll talk about that a bit later. 5th edition Fantasy Battle for me, though, is an absolutely massive one, because what this did, this was the last sort of Hero Hammer box set in Warhammer Fantasy, if you ask me, the way that it was played at least. This one was huge because it released two full factions to the world that we didn't really have a lot of before in Bretonnians and Lizardmen. Bretonnians in particular were a huge hit. I had a Bretonnian army and a Lizardman army, and I think every single kid that I knew in Cambridge also did. At least if they didn't have a full army, they had a gigantic triangular wedge of knights on horses for a Bretonnia army. Even if you didn't collect Bretonnians, it was just amazing to have all of these fancy knights, because every kid back then loved sort of medieval knights in armor. I still do. And 4th edition fantasy was really healthy and very popular too, but I just feel that 5th edition, it did something so bold in not giving you goblins or high elves or dwarves or empire. It gave you Bretonnians and Lizardmen. And Lizardmen were something pretty new at this point. I mean, we'd seen some things about Slan and stuff before that, Zotes and whatnot, But the full Lizardmen refresh was just huge. Even if the miniatures are a little bit derpy now, at the time it was just massive. The heraldry, the plumes, the bright vivid colours on the Bretonnians were just so Warhammer. And, you know, this is something that survives today in the old world, of course. Skipping forward quite a long way, we have a really interesting one here, and this was Cursed City. Now, this is a Warhammer Quest release. Warhammer Quest, I remember, was released when I was a wee teenager, and it was a great game. It was like Hero Quest, really, combined with Warhammer Fantasy, sort of RPG elements in there. It was a dungeon crawler, and it was a really cool game. But there's been a few additions. I think prior to this, there was Silver Tower, maybe, which wasn't quite as popular, but Cursed City, what this did is it gave you tremendous value in a box. It was a huge box, and it sold out instantly. You just couldn't get it anywhere, partly because the people that bought this were buying it for the miniatures. This is the first time that we really had a box set that was a specialist game, I suppose, a board game, to want for a better term. This was something that people were buying just for the miniatures because, frankly, it was really good value because you got about 3 bazillion miniatures in there for the heroes and the baddies. The setting was awesome, and the aesthetic and the design of the miniatures was truly spectacular. And I'm still seeing a lot of conversions, kit bashes, and paint jobs at things like Golden Demon on people's Instagram all over the place. Cursed City was a massive hit, and it's interesting because I don't actually know too many people that actually played the game. In some ways, it's kind of similar to Space Hulk, except it doesn't have that iconic sort of feel to it. But again, just the value, the sheer amount of plastic you got in this box just seemed like a really good idea to get. If you like the heroes, then they're worth having. You see them on eBay because people buy this box and then split it up into lots of bits to try and make money out of it. But the undead bad guys in this were, something that you could add to your Age of Sigmar armies, but they were just fantastic miniatures, quite frankly. And again, this is a board game that people could get into around a weekend and just have a sort of beer and pretzels kind of time with. It's a fairly simple game, and, but again, I reiterate, really, most people were buying it for the miniatures. Now, here is the most recent and most interesting one that I really wanted to talk about, and this is the main reason why I wanted to do this video. The Space Wolf army set. Apparently, it seems to be widely known now, this is the biggest Games Workshop box release of all time, and it came this year, or the tail end of last year, I can't remember now. It's not been out very long. Space Wolves, a faction that are, I would say, not one of the most popular Space Marine factions, got a full glow up with this brand new box set that came out of kind of nowhere, really. And the level of detail, design, and genuinely awesome stuff that this had in it was just perfect. They went about the marketing of this really well, and what they delivered was pretty much perfect. And this is coming from someone who just frankly doesn't like Space Wolves. This actually appealed to me. So to make me actually look at a faction and go, wow, that is beautiful, but still not really have any interest in that faction, this was really amazing. And I can tell you at Adepticon earlier this year, there were so many Space Wolf models, particularly the Terminators from this box set, in those cabinets. Some of them won gold and whatnot in some of the categories, if I can remember correctly. These miniatures are just so nice, and they have made Space Wolves cool again, really. The only thing that was missing was, of course, Russ himself, but I have a feeling that he might be headed back pretty soon, and that really will be the cherry on the top of an absolutely fantastic release. Now here's where it gets interesting, because Age of Sigmar was not for everybody. It certainly wasn't for me. I'm an old fogey, and, I miss the time of Warhammer Fantasy. I've always been a sci-fi minded person. I do prefer 40k as a setting than fantasy, even as a kid. But, when they moved things on and they had the end times and they had the old world brought in, it lost a lot of the old grognards like me along the way, and I just kind of lost interest. Granted, the miniatures are amazing, incredibly detailed and really cool to look at and stuff. I just didn't particularly resonate with the setting and the Sigmarines and all that stuff. I've heard it's a very good game, but it's just not on my list of things to get into anytime soon, so there you go. However, What Games Workshop did that was very, very interesting is they released something called The Old World. Now, The Old World is basically a reset of Warhammer Fantasy, certain editions blended together to make, you know, the rank and file games that we knew and loved as children back in the 80s and 90s. Now, this was really interesting because I don't think they realised just how well this would do, but all of the old grognards and greybeards came out of the woodwork and were like, give us Bretonnians again. Give us Cathay, an army that only ever existed in Total War games. Give us all of the juicy old world stuff that we used to have, and we will buy it. And boy, has it sold well. I know a ton of people that play Old World. In fact, I know a lot more people that play Old World than actually play Age of Sigmar. That could just be my circle. And maybe the age group of the friends that I have and stuff, but there's definitely a lot more appeal for me, and I have to say, there was really, they were missing something. There was a bit of soul missing from Age of Sigmar, if you ask me, and I think they've brought that back with Old World, and it has helped appease the old grognards like myself somewhat. And this is nostalgia done really well. They released old miniatures and sort of spliced in some new ones, but kept the aesthetic and the vibe bang on. So well done. Hats off to you, Games Workshop, for this one. Again, going back to the many different editions of Warhammer and 40k, one release that really sticks out to me was actually the last edition of 40k, which was Leviathan. Now, this box set was very well marketed. There were some really good sort of viral campaigns that went out, and most importantly, Games Workshop sent out bazillions of boxes of Leviathan to every single TikToker, Instagram painter. I didn't get one, by the way, but everyone else got one, and this was a huge box. 10th edition, that is a big number. Suddenly we're in 2 digits, and the 10th edition box set did a full reset of Tyranids. It made Tyranids far more appealing to me. They redesigned them and made them actually look scary for once. They weren't derpy like they used to be, in my opinion. And, the Terminators were a huge thing. They scaled up Terminators. They brought them back. The aesthetic was, just refined and made better in every way. You also got an absolute bucket ton of miniatures in this box set. I think it was just a huge amount of Tyranids and Space Marines in this box set. So it was a great place to start playing 40k. Obviously, we've got 11th edition coming out soon. I'm quite excited about it. I think the Orcs and the Space Marines look great, but it does feel like they've cut back a bit on the amount of miniatures that you get in the box, and it hasn't been marketed and pushed quite as well as I would have liked, to be honest. And I think 10th edition was far more of a big deal overall. And I think when you look at all the 40k editions, really Leviathan does stand out to me as a really well done release that a lot of people know and love. Leviathan was a really aggressive release from Games Workshop. They absolutely attacked every single avenue. It was everywhere. Just the face of the Terminator and the Hive Tyrant there was just really instantly recognizable as 40k. It was already iconic, and every single social media person was going on about it. Talking about 40k editions, this is slightly less flashy, but arguably more important in some ways. This was Assault on Black Reach. Now, this was the 5th edition, I believe, Warhammer 40k starter set, and for a lot of people that entered the hobby, this was and is Warhammer 40k personified. It stayed around for years, and it was mega good value. You got an absolute ton of miniatures in here for a very agreeable price indeed. This was when prices were somewhat reasonable for the plastic that we all know and collect. You had 2 factions that everybody wanted. You had the Space Marines and the Orcs, and honestly, going back to it, this was the first time that I ever remember seeing people 2 friends would buy a box and then they'd split it, and someone would get the Orcs, someone would get the Space Marines, and this happened a lot because it was just great value. You had multiple vehicles in this box set. I believe you had a Dreadnought and 2 of the chopper things that you had with the Orcs, and Orcs were always hugely popular, and this matters more than just a sellout weekend. This was long-term volume, and it was around for a while, and it was a fantastic release. The same can be said at a similar sort of time for the Battle for Skull Pass, which was, I believe, Warhammer Fantasy 7th edition. This was the one that had, I believe, goblins and dwarves in it, and you got an absolute ton of models. And again, it was just really good value, and a lot of fantasy players were splitting this box. Some people wanted the dwarves, some people wanted the goblins. Both of those factions were two of the most popular factions in the game at the time. I had so many mates that were into dwarves and goblins, to be honest, and it was just a really awesome edition of Warhammer Fantasy as well. And the craziest thing about this is I've seen somewhere that the price of this box set was actually 40 quid when it was released. Now, I don't know the year that it was released in, but 40 quid for that box set is just absolutely bananas to me. The amount of plastic that you got in it was just crazy. Last but not least, we'll talk about one of Games Workshop's formats that's doing particularly well at the moment, and this is Combat Patrol and Spearhead. What is so good about Combat Patrol and Spearhead is that they are small boxes or mini armies, basically, that if you play 40k or Age of Sigmar, are a really good sort of pillar, well-designed starting point for people entering the hobby or to begin starting an army. If you already play 40k, especially like at tournament level or something, and you just need like a boost and you want to just get a bunch of miniatures for a cut price, by the way, because generally speaking, if you grouped all of the stuff together in these boxes, you usually get 2 or 3 squads and a vehicle, say, or a monster. If it's Age of Sigmar, you're usually getting something for free or a heavily discounted price. This is an excellent strategy for Games Workshop, and these things just sell and sell and sell. They don't do anything too remarkable, but it's just a really good format. When I think about wanting to start 40k or Age of Sigmar, that is the place that we start at. Not to mention the fact that Spearhead and Combat Patrol are actually game modes in themselves. So you can just play a game using the contents of those boxes. It's not too overwhelming getting a Combat Patrol and building it up. You can take a few hours to build up 2 or 3 squads and a vehicle, say. It's not going to take you, weeks to get done. And you could, really paint them quite quickly as well. And I think it's like that perfect size for most people to be able to handle without feeling totally overwhelmed by their big grey pile of shame. Combat Patrol and Spearhead have just nailed it for me, and I've bought Combat Patrols and I don't even play 40k at the moment just because of the value that you get in those boxes. For example, I bought the Red Corsairs one recently. I needed the squad of the Raiders in there to finish one of my video series for Badab. I got the Rhino to use for my World Eaters Horus Heresy army, and I got the Beastmen in there to use for a Necromunda Venator gang. So you can do stuff like that, and you can use them for multiple different projects. I do think that these two sort of systems, the way that they format this, is just very, very well done. So all in all, if you look at Games Workshop's biggest successes over the years that I've been in the hobby, they fall into several different categories. You've got the big launch boxes for editions of 40k or Warhammer. These are the pillar that they sort of build everything around, and these are pretty much on a 3-year cycle, so we always know we're going to get something massive every 3 years now. You've got the big sort of faction refreshes and glow-ups that we saw with the Adeptus Sororitas and Space Wolves, of course, too. And then you've got the long-term sellers like the Combat Patrols and the Spearhead. And all of this added together creates a very, very successful company that we know and love. So when people ask the question of what is the most successful or best-selling Warhammer product of all time, the answer isn't really that clean. But there is a very clear pattern, and the winners aren't just the ones that sell out immediately. They're the ones that either sell for years and years, bring people into the hobby, or give people something they've been waiting a long time for. And the best ones usually do all three. Thanks for watching.